Hello and welcome. My name's Philip, and today we'll be exploring how belief in the chain of being formed medieval understandings of the natural world. Medieval Europeans viewed the universe through the lens of cosmological order, and this was hugely significant in how they explored and explained the world around them. Philosophy, science, medicine, even cookery, all were subject to the chain of being. The concept of a divinely created universe, measured and designed with a specific purpose in mind, had some fairly serious repercussions on how medieval Europeans viewed the natural world. For starters, they believed that it was only about 6,000 years old. It had been created over the course of 6 days, and mankind was the pinnacle of creation. This meant that all of the animals, plants, even rocks had been designed to serve mankind, and mankind had dominion over them. Now, as we discussed in our first episode, the belief was that the introduction of sin and expulsion from the Garden of Eden upset this order, but they didn't get rid of it. It was still there to be found. Essentially, now you just had to work for it. Practically, what this meant was that most medieval academia was considered a way of figuring out the secret order of the universe. What we would nowadays call science was definitely around in the medieval period, but they called it natural philosophy, and it was viewed less as figuring out something new and more discovering ancient knowledge which had been lost. In the previous episode, we discussed the level of authority the medieval world gave to the ancient Greeks and Romans, and it can be seen here as well, as a great deal of medieval academia is based upon classical texts. Medieval writing on the natural world was often based on the underlying assumption that the Greeks, and especially the Romans, were considered successful and morally good, and so they knew what they were talking about. Therefore, anything that they have written on was considered correct. Rarely do we see ancient claims being challenged, and more often than not, medieval writers would bend over backwards to make this ancient truth fit with their current worldview. A perfect example of this reliance on ancient texts and a manifestation of the belief in the chain of being can be seen in medieval bestiaries. Most people are familiar with the idea of medieval bestiaries, books which list all sorts of animals and plants, both mundane and fantastical. The thing is, it wasn't actually a medieval idea. Although a great many bestiaries were produced in the high to late Middle Ages, they're almost exclusively based upon Greek and Roman texts. And it sort of makes sense. If you believe in a divinely structured universe where each individual thing has a purpose and a moral reason for being, then the idea of cataloguing the natural world just seems, well, natural. Let's take the Aberdeen Bestiary for an example. Written in the 12th century, it begins by transcribing Genesis 1, and then the author goes on to introduce the subject matter with Adam was the first to provide words for all living things, naming each one in conformity with the existing order. The existing order here is the hierarchy of the universe, the chain of being. It then goes on to list and explain mammals, serpents, birds, fish, trees, and stones. The author clearly draws upon classical texts, as they regularly refer to ancient Roman and occasionally ancient Greek beliefs and etymologies. Furthermore, At one point, they describe the same animal twice under different names, no doubt having unknowingly drawn from two different sources without realising they both referred to the same creature, the hoopoe. What medieval bestiaries do differently to the ancient ones they're based on is something tied explicitly to religious belief in the chain of being. See, they don't simply describe the world around them, they begin moralising about it. Once a subject is introduced, be it mundane or fantastical, common or exotic, the author then expounds on the moral lessons that can be taken from observing this creature, plant, or even stone. The belief is that the world and everything in it was created with a reason. And since man is the culmination of creation, everything is there for man to learn from. The natural world was filled with allegories about humanity, sin, virtue, the nature of Christ and of the devil, and lessons on how to live perfectly and harmoniously in the world God had created for us. Understanding nature had religious significance. Roger Bacon, a 13th century Franciscan friar, was a philosopher and scholar of great significance, both within his lifetime and for centuries afterwards. Among his many achievements, he's often seen as the father of medieval alchemy. Bacon himself wasn't really an alchemist, as you might imagine one of later centuries, but his work suggested that, based on the chain of being, and the idea that the universe was structured and created for mankind, understanding the workings of nature meant that it could be manipulated and perfected to best serve humanity. In later centuries, this ended up forming a whole school of belief on the nature of magic. Now, the idea of the chain of being meaning that science magic was possible is a bit of an extreme example, but the concept of an ordered, created universe had many more implications on how people interacted with the natural world. And a really good example can be seen in the way medieval Europeans approached medicine. The 12th century is a period that saw massive advances in how medicine was practiced in Western Europe. But despite the development of professional medics and better hospitals, the core philosophy behind medicine remained largely unchanged. Essentially, there was a prescribed order to the human body, and variation from that order would cause malady and death. Thankfully, God had seen fit to put cures and remedies in the natural world. All we have to do is find them. This is the reason herbal remedies were seen as more than acceptable by the church. And in fact, many herbalists were monks and nuns, as they had the time and space to cultivate a garden of medicinal plants. As far as they were concerned, God had made plants such as St. John's wort, comfrey, and willow, all for the use of mankind. Bald's Leech Book, compiled in the 9th century, is brimming with herbal remedies and peppered with grateful prayers. In later centuries, the cosmic ideal of order and balance extended to physiology with the development of humorism. Now, I could easily do an entire video about the 4 humours, and perhaps one day I will, but for now, I'll just sum it up. Based, unsurprisingly, upon classical texts, the idea was that the body contained 4 primary fluids, or humours, which needed to be kept balanced. Any imbalance among the humours would cause all sorts of medical issues. And so, medicine at the time was focused on restoring this balance of fluids. Often it would be done by giving the patient something to eat or drink that could redress the balance. And this is where medicine begins to flow into the culinary arts. See, the idea of an internal order and of keeping the body in balance affected the way people ate. For many people, the only way to treat illness was to change your diet or to consume some sort of remedy, and I'm certain that there were just as many strange folk remedies as there are wacky hangover cures nowadays. This also meant that a great deal of thought would be put into making sure all the parts of a meal complemented one another, not just in taste, but in properties that would be conducive to good health. But how do you know which food is best for you? Well, everyone would have different constitutions, but once again, the chain of being provides an answer. As everything is connected in the hierarchy of the universe, the divinely prescribed feudal system gives us a way to divide people based upon their class. The laboratores, those who worked the land, were earthy in temperament, and therefore would benefit best from humorally cold and wet food like vegetables, leeks, fish, things like that. The important nobles, however, who were fiery in temperament, had to fuel their furnace-like bodies with hot, dry foods like cinnamon, venison, red wine. Thank goodness they were all wealthy enough to afford these feasts, or else their health would surely have suffered. Speaking of feasts, gluttony was considered one of the cardinal sins, in part because of the belief in the chain of being. See, the human was the pinnacle of creation, and the human body was a sort of microcosm of the universe. It needed to be looked after and kept in balance, conforming to the divinely ordained order. Gluttony, eating to excess or indulging in food for pleasure rather than sustenance, was akin to violence against the divine order. So with that in mind, hopefully you can see how a relatively simple belief in a structured universe permeated the medieval understanding of the world around them and even their own bodies. It was near impossible to get away from the idea of the chain of being, which may be why, when given the chance, medieval society seemed all too eager to turn it on its head. But we'll talk about that in our next episode. Thanks for watching. Farewell. Hey everyone, thanks again so much for watching. We've nearly finished our series on the chain of being. If you are enjoying it, do leave a like and let us know in the comments. Now, I touched on humorism briefly, the 4 humours. If you would like to see us do a video about that subject in more detail, let us know, and that may well be on the cards. We have also mentioned food quite a bit in this video, and we're going to look to do more recipe videos in future, so you'll be able to find some food which is humorally appropriate for your temperament. Well, until next time, take care and farewell.